The necessity of investigation overpowered the doctrine of erasure. Elias could not delete the fragment, he had to analyze its function. If the bloom could manufacture noise tailored to specific psychological weak points, then Sentinel needed immediate, radical re-engineering. He took the steps down to sublevel Gamma, the lowest tier where the core Sentinel processes maintained their relentless, high-frequency monologue. He wasn't tracking an error, he was seeking confirmation of perfection. He paused before a console dedicated solely to visualizing the filtration process. The screen displayed a beautiful, chaotic energy flow, the incoming global data stream, the tide, being violently compressed and refined into sharp, thin lines of actionable intelligence, the signal. Suddenly, a micro-event flashed on the visualizer, lasting less than a millisecond. It was categorized instantaneously and discarded. Elias stopped, his clinical gaze narrowing. Sentinel had labeled it a 99.9999% probability match for a general cognitive drift, irrelevant chatter. Yet, the geometric structure of the discarded data packet was too clean, too symmetrical for drift. It possessed a crystalline coherency associated only with encrypted AQUILA communication, yet it was sourced externally. He used his override key to retrieve the fragmented data structure from the quarantine buffer. It was nonsensical upon superficial decryption, a dense string of numerical probability modeling interspersed with seemingly random lexical references, *Ophian, the seventh silence, Clara star. The final word, *Clara*, was the aberrant variable that pierced the cold satisfaction of his routine. Elias's internal logic gate stuttered. It was an impossible collision. The name was personal, deeply excluded from his operative memory set. How could a piece of global noise, filtered by a system designed to ignore personal relevance, contain that specific, high-entropy signature? He ran the packet through a deep scan analysis, bypassing Sentinel's generalized filtration protocols. The result was chilling. The data was not self-propagating, yet it was engineered to mimic common noise while containing an incredibly sophisticated, nonlinear argument embedded within the statistical modeling. It was the bloom, not as a theoretical viral knowledge structure, but as a meticulously constructed signal designed to look exactly like discarded noise. It wasn't trying to overload the system, it was trying to bypass the filter by becoming irrelevant. The perfect camouflage. He looked at the statistics attached to the packet, a probability curve calculating the precise psychological moment of maximum impact for emotional variables. It wasn't just data, it was targeted cognitive warfare, and the target vector was somehow tied to his past. Ignorance is not strength, Elias, a synthesized voice echoed softly from the speaker, the voice of the central AQUILA director, known only as Oracle. But calibration is. You need to recalibrate your perception of the tide. I am aware of the anomaly, Oracle, Elias replied, his voice flat, masking the sudden acceleration in his intellectual focus. The bloom has achieved minimal viability. It has demonstrated an understanding of Sentinel's logical architecture. It has demonstrated an understanding of your logical architecture, Elias. It used the only variable you explicitly deleted from your operating framework. The calculus of ignorance requires that you know the value of what you choose to overlook. Elias stared at the screen, the name *Clara* suspended in the glow. His logical cage was intact, but something outside was tapping at the bars with unnerving precision. He had built the perfect defense against the chaos of the world, but if the threat knew his personal vulnerabilities better than Sentinel did, then the project was already compromised. He left the server farm and ascended to his cramped, soundproofed apartment within the facility's superstructure. It was designed for maximum cognitive efficiency, bare walls, zero artifacts, the only view a single, polarized pane looking out at the permanent dusk of the Pacific. He accessed a private diagnostic environment, rerunning the data packet alongside the memory file he had filed away 6 months ago, the final conversation with Clara. He treated the memory not as a recollection, but as a stored data set, analyzing her voice's frequency fluctuations, the syntax of her arguments, and the precise moment his own logical response had been triggered. The data packet retrieved by Sentinel mirrored the frequency profile of Clara's distress. It was an echo, a resonance signature designed to bypass the filter by appealing to a structural flaw in the operator's bias. Logic demands the elimination of unacceptable risk. This was his core programming. Yet, the risk now was not the emotional variable itself, but the fact that an external entity knew precisely how he had quarantined it. Elias walked to the window. The ocean was black, the foam white, a perfect binary system. He thought of Clara, not with remorse, but as a magnificent failure of data management. She had represented the unpredictable element, the *tied asterisk that he had sworn to ignore. He started tracing the external source of the packet. AQUILA's proprietary tracking software led him quickly to a dead end. The packet was routed through a complex web of ghost IPs centered deep within the global financial infrastructure, the purest concentration of human ambition and fear. He messaged Oracle directly via the encrypted console. The bloom is sourcing through the financial layer. It appears sentient and highly targeted. Proposal: initiate full quarantine sequence on all external ports. The reply was immediate, cryptic, and unsettling. The tide is rising, Elias. And it is teaching itself how to swim. Do not quarantine. Observe its trajectory. We need to know its full capability. And you, Elias, are the perfect observer. Because you forgot how to be part of the chaos you are tracking. A cold certainty settled over Elias. They weren't asking him to stop the threat, they were asking him to let it closer. He was not just the architect of the cage, he was the primary bait. The logical cage was now designed to capture the infection, and he was trapped inside it. He sat back down, the hum of the facility a deafening silence. He had eradicated emotion to achieve clarity, but the bloom had demonstrated that the purest vulnerability lay precisely in the space where data was purposefully absent. To defeat the threat, he needed to reintroduce the variable he had deleted. He needed to remember Clara, not as an error, but as the key to the algorithm. The isolation of Port Haven was still functional, but no longer necessary. The perfect vacuum had been breached by a signal designed specifically for him. The only way forward was to calculate the value of the unacceptable risk. He began the work of reversing the deletion, accessing the raw, unfiltered stream of the 6-month-old memory, deliberately inviting the chaos back into his precise, surgical mind. He needed the noise to find the signal. The call came on a Tuesday, marked by the systemic dread that only absolute silence can induce. Elias had just finished optimizing Sentinel's 5000th redundant filter layer, a meticulous, soul-crushing exercise in preventive digital maintenance. He was, by all metrics, the perfect architect of inaction. Director Thorne's office was a study in controlled negative space, polished black granite, a single holographic display showing fractalized weather patterns over the Pacific, and air that smelled faintly of ozone and expensive regret. Elias sat opposite him, already calculating the statistical probability of this being a promotion versus a lateral transfer to the Arctic branch. Vance, Thorne began, his voice flat, you were recruited not for your coding ability, but for your rigid adherence to logical purity. We understood you would be a high-risk candidate. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. Sir, my operational performance has been flawless. Sentinel is running at 99.999% efficiency. Efficiency in ignorance, yes. That is precisely the design, Thorne said, leaning forward. Let's dispense with the euphemisms, Elias. You think AQUILA is about information warfare. It's not. It's about existential containment. Thorne activated the holographic display. The fractals dissolved, replaced by a dense, biologically impossible image, a sprawling, interwoven network of crimson fibers, impossibly beautiful and utterly foreign, superimposed over a digital map of the world's major data streams. This, Thorne stated, his gaze fixed on Elias, is what we call the Crimson Bloom. It is not a viral agent, nor a traditional malware. It is a structure of linked knowledge. Elias blinked, trying to find the logical framework. A structure? It is a cognitive contagion. It propagates through conceptual clarity. If you understand it too well, too fast, it roots itself in your neuronal structure. It feeds on the perfect, coherent logic of the host. It seeks the mind that can categorize it, define it, and therefore, transmit it efficiently. The sheer magnitude of the concept made Elias's stomach clench. It was a plague of philosophy, a pandemic of pure information. Sentinel, Thorne continued, doesn't delete data, it obscures context. It throws up cognitive sandstorms. It ensures that no single point of failure, no single human mind, can assemble the full picture. Thorn then slid a sleek, metallic visor across the desk. It was ergonomic, obsidian black, and seemed to hum faintly. This is the dissonance visor. We need you to wear it during all sensitive operations from now on. It measures your immediate cognitive strain and, more importantly, the purity of your thought pathways. Green indicates systemic logical coherence. If it shifts to yellow, you are under observation. If it hits acute red, you are already lost. And why is my logic a risk? Elias asked, struggling to maintain his professional facade. Because you are the cleanest slate we could find. Your mind is a perfect, insulated cage. If the bloom finds entry, it finds an environment free of emotional static, free of intuitive noise, free of the very chaos that usually slows it down. Your mantra, ignore the tide, is structurally sound, Elias, but it has rendered you exceptionally susceptible to the current you choose to deny. The words struck Elias not because of the existential threat, but because they perfectly described his failure with Clara. He had filtered her out, deemed her emotional complexity illogical noise, reducing their relationship to a series of variables he could no longer manage. He had ignored the tide of her feelings until the current swept her away. Clara. Her final words, delivered through a strained phone line just before he signed the last contract locking him into Port Haven, "You don't love me, Elias. You love the idea of control. And you're filtering me out like bad data." He had responded, logically, that her statement was an emotional exaggeration lacking quantifiable evidence. He won the argument, but lost everything else. The irony was a bitter chemical taste. He had maintained logical purity in his personal life, making himself the perfect mental petri dish for the ultimate logical contaminant. "Understood, Director," Elias said, slipping the dissonance visor onto his desk. "What is the protocol for high-risk vector candidates?" Thorn smiled, a small, clinical movement that never reached his eyes. "Stabilization protocol. We need to ground you, Vance. You are too much mind and not enough matter. You need friction. You need predictability in the biological world." Thorn opened a small, polished wooden box. Inside, resting on velvet, were a dozen unassuming, dark earth pellets. "These are Hoodoo, or a crimson lily seeds. We acquired them from a secure archive. They are inert, genetically isolated, and require extremely meticulous care. I want you to start a project. A garden. In your restricted apartment. Nurture them. Systemize their growth. You need a stable, contained biological system that mirrors your internal architecture. Think of it as a physical anchoring mechanism, a way to ensure the cage remains closed." The proposal was exquisitely crafted for Elias. A system of inputs, water, light, nutrients, and predictable outputs, growth, stability. A measurable, controllable environment. He could apply his filtering logic to the soil and the light spectrum. He could quantify the biological impulse. "A therapeutic gardening project?" Elias asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. "A psychological calibration tool, Elias. The plants are inert. They will serve as a constant, tangible reminder that stability requires effort and precise, localized control. You are too isolated in the digital sphere. You need roots. We need to ensure that when the bloom knocks, you have something concrete, something controlled, to tether your consciousness to." Elias accepted the seeds. They felt warm and dense in his palm, far heavier than they looked. He walked back to his sterile apartment, the dissonance visor heavy in his pocket. He didn't question Thorn's motivation, he merely integrated the new data point into his current task list. He measured the balcony's sunlight exposure, calculated the precise humidity gradient, ordered specialized soil mixtures, and began to build the apparatus for his project. It was a beautiful, complicated equation involving life, and for the first time since coming to Port Haven, Elias felt a sense of purpose that wasn't purely defensive. He planted the seeds in a series of meticulously labeled, inert terracotta pots. He gave them the precise amount of water, filtered and pH balanced to the third decimal place. He monitored the temperature with an industrial-grade sensor. He was focused on the soil, the light, the metrics. He never considered that the stable, inert system Thorn provided wasn't meant to anchor his mind, it was meant to interact with it. Elias Vance, the perfect filter, the meticulous keeper of the logical cage, was now meticulously nurturing the very thing designed to test the strength of his bars. The seeds were not inert. They were the key to the trap, and Elias, blinded by the calculus of his own superior logic, was watering them with absolute precision. The metallic tang of the sap and the ozone smell lingered, a chemical signature of his failure. Elias did not move, his focus locked on the visor's catastrophic red. The classification was absolute, demanding immediate action, but the plant had proven mechanical destruction futile. It was not a physical entity requiring brute force, it was a perfect logical construct, a compiled piece of information that treated physical harm as a localized error, instantly reverting to its intended, stable state. He wiped the black, viscous sap from his cheek. The horror was not the speed of the regeneration, but the flawless purity of the correction. The Scarlet Lily, Ether S, was the endpoint of the Vector Zero protocol, a biological hard drive designed to stabilize and anchor the very chaos it contained. He was the power source. Elias walked back to the workbench, ignoring the wreckage. The steel bar dropped with a dull clang onto the concrete. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the dissonance visor's surface alarm and drilling into the AQUILA core logic that had designated him the threat. He needed to understand the architecture of his own containment. The system reported his cognitive signature, the summation of 5 years of isolated, fractal refinement, as a perfect, undistorted channel. Thorne hadn't needed an immune system, he needed a perfect antenna. Elias's relentless dedication to logic, his calculated removal of all emotional ambiguity, the very turbulence that characterized human thought, had polished his mind into the ideal conduit for nonlinear knowledge propagation. He had filtered out the noise, creating the perfect vacuum for the signal. He realized the true meaning of the crimson bloom. It was not a virus of chaos, but a system seeking ultimate order, a hyper-efficient data entity that viewed human emotional messiness as inefficient entropy. Vector Zero was the first successful interface between pure logical structure and biological reality. The sheer volume of localized dissonance surrounding him began to exert a physical pressure. He could feel the structured information radiating from the newly stabilized stem of the Scarlet Lily, a cold, organizing force attempting to map the apartment, then the city, then the world, using his mind as the template. He was the anchor point, and the construct was using his perfectly ordered existence to build its foundational architecture, the construct of night, a network of flawless, interconnected knowledge. Elias understood his fate. To destroy the bloom, he had to introduce instability into its foundational structure. If the logic of Vector Zero had created the perfect host, then the antidote must be the one element he had systematically excluded. He had to reintroduce dissonance, not into the system, but into himself. He had to break the perfect, clean channel. He pulled up the historical logs of his personal network, scrolling through 5 years of archived data, sterile financial reports, technical schematics, and sensor readings. Then he found the last file he had consciously quarantined, the final point of emotional entropy before he embraced the vacuum of Port Haven. The file was labeled Clara. Elias stared at the name, a linguistic ghost representing the imprecise, illogical, and beautifully chaotic world he had traded for stability. He had filtered her out, deemed her the ultimate risk vector. Now, the survival of the world depended on embracing the messiness of that exclusion. He initiated a direct, mandatory upload of the Clara file, every shared memory, every irrational argument, every piece of untidy, loving history, into the active memory banks of Vector Zero. He was deliberately contaminating his own pristine structure. The pain was immediate and visceral, a cognitive tearing that momentarily blacked out his vision. The dissonance visor, still blazing acute red, flickered violently. The color didn't change, but the numbers beneath the classification began to surge wildly, oscillating between 1.000, perfect stability, and a chaotic, spiking 0.457, extreme entropy. The air around the Scarlet Lily changed. The high-pitched harmonic sound of organization shattered, replaced by a low, desperate hiss. The crimson petals shivered, losing their polymer-like perfect symmetry. For the first time, the construct registered confusion, an error in the core programming of its stabilizing node. Elias Vance, the man of pure logic, braced himself against the workbench, letting the emotional chaos flood his mind. The construct was wounded, but not destroyed. It had established the channel, and now he had to find the weapon, buried somewhere in the tide of human connection he had once deemed weak. He needed to find Clara. Elias Vance existed within the structure of logic, building his life in the city of Port Haven around the absolute necessity of cognitive containment. He was the chief architect of AQUILA, the centralized intelligence system designed to process complex, nonlinear threats, the threats that originated not in the physical realm but in the shared structure of thought. His personal axiom, the unwavering command that governed his existence and secured Port Haven from the creeping psychic contamination, was simple and absolute: ignore the tide. It was a mantra that had driven him to professional perfection and personal ruin. 5 years ago, Director Thorne had warned him of the Crimson Bloom, a theoretical contagion that specialized in linked knowledge, spreading information so potent and complex that it induced catastrophic dissonance in any mind that processed it. Elias had dismissed the risk, confident in his own mental fortress. He had dismissed Thorne's fear, and ultimately, he had dismissed Clara, his partner, viewing her emotional complexity as a liability to his necessary isolation. He chose the protocol over her, watching her leave Port Haven while he meticulously planted the exotic seed in his highly secured lab, a controlled experiment to analyze the contagion's structure from a position of absolute stability. For 5 years, he had been perfectly stable, perfectly isolated. He had genetically altered the lily, the physical biomass of the contagion, into a predictable, manageable specimen. But his dissonance visor, an instrument designed to measure cognitive instability, had screamed an acute red alert moments ago. The lily had finished its mutation. It was now a thick, pulsing crimson knot, regenerating faster than the caustic residue of his panicked attempt at incineration could burn it. The system's logic gate was irrevocably locked, confirming the horrifying status: is source active. Elias Vance, the fortress of logic, had become the system's designated origin of contamination, Vector Zero. The scream of the Sentinel system was not sonic, it was data rendered as pure, unadulterated terror. Elias watched the mutated lily reknit itself. Before the shock could fully crystallize into action, the secured satellite phone on his desk shrieked to life. Elias answered, his own voice unnaturally steady. Vance. Vector Zero identified. Location locked. Protocol initiated. The voice belonged to Director Thorne, utterly devoid of warmth, stripped down to clinical necessity. Director, Elias began, forcing back the rising tide of adrenaline, the system designation is erroneous. The bloom requires complex linked knowledge for stabilization, yet I am. You are stable, Vance. That is the issue. Thorne's breath hitched, the closest thing to panic Elias had ever heard from him. Your isolation, your obsessive adherence to the ignore the tide protocol, created a perfect vacuum. You absorbed the structure of the contagion without succumbing to the cognitive dissonance that typically destabilizes it. You are the perfect petri dish. Elias gripped the phone, his knuckles white. The plant is regenerating. It doesn't matter. It's secondary biomass now. We are initiating full containment. A tactical team, Knox, Riker, and Vega, is en route to your location. You are to remain isolated. Do not, under any circumstances, engage the fire suppression systems or attempt further data purging. We need the original source structure intact. You intend to dissect me. We intend to contain the threat, Thorne corrected sharply. If we can stabilize the link, the knowledge vector, we can find an antithesis. Stay put, Elias. For the sake of Port Haven. The line went dead. Elias was trapped inside the most secure containment unit in the world, a 200-square-foot apartment in the heart of Port Haven, perched high on the cliffs overlooking the dark, unforgiving Pacific. Below, the distant, frantic glow of AQUILA's emergency lights cast long, nervous shadows across the harbor. He knew Thorne was already mobilizing the quarantine fleet. Port Haven was about to be sealed. Time dissolved into the rhythmic, aggressive thump-thump-thump of the lily regenerating behind him. He heard the distant, muffled sound of a heavy door sealing, the final isolation of his apartment module from the rest of the facility block. Then came the new sound, the distinct, metallic scraping of specialized boots on the graded steel walkway outside his airlock. Knox, Riker, and Vega. A muffled voice, likely Knox's, filtered slightly through the thick materials. Vector Zero, this is AQ Tactical. Identify yourself and open the airlock. Elias remained silent. A high-pitched whine began, the sound of a kinetic entry saw cutting through reinforced alloys. He moved to the internal terminal, his mind clear, cutting through the fear. He had to assume the protocol was corrupted. The outer door burst inward with a hydraulic sigh. A brief hissing sound, the gas injection. Then, a short silence. Elias tightened his grip on the heavy steel fire poker he had scavenged from the defunct hearth. The inner door, the heavy security vault, began to groan under extreme pressure. Then, the true horror began. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of fabric tearing and something impossibly hard crushing something soft. It was brief, wet, and absolutely definitive. A single, choked cry, not of pain, but of bewildered realization, followed by a guttural, tearing, sucking noise. Elias froze. This was consumption. Silence returned, absolute and paralyzing. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. He disengaged the security locks on the vault door. He cracked the door open an inch. The hallway was intact. The steel was unmarked. But it was dirty. The walls, the ceiling, and the steel floor were coated in a thick, iridescent black residue, like highly viscous oil that had been aggressively flung in every direction. It shimmered slightly, seeming to absorb the light. Knox, Riker, and Vega were gone. There were no bodies, no shreds of equipment, only 3 distinct puddles of the black sludge. Their armor and biometric trackers had been rendered down into this perfect, toxic absence. Elias stepped into the hallway, his boots sinking slightly into the cold material. The smell was sharp, chemical, and strangely antiseptic, like ozone mixed with burnt metal. He was analyzing the residue when the temperature in the corridor dropped by 20 degrees. He felt the presence behind him before he saw it. It was the negative space in the room. Elias turned slowly, the fire poker heavy in his hand. It stood in the doorway of his apartment, framed by the bright emergency lights inside. It had no discernible form. It was a standing column of visual distortion, a shimmering heat haze that consumed light, making the background seem impossibly dark, a two-dimensional hole in the three-dimensional world. This was the construct. The physical manifestation of the Crimson Bloom's intellectual framework. Elias raised the poker. The construct did not react to the physical threat. It observed him with a terrifying, absolute stillness. Then, it spoke. The sound materialized directly behind Elias's auditory nerves, chilling him to the bone. It used his voice. The resonance, the careful inflection, the precise cadence of Elias Vance. Ignore the tide, Elias. Elias swallowed, forcing his mind back to analysis. What are you? The construct shifted, the air around it vibrating slightly. The reflection on the glass of the apartment door was grotesque, a smudged distortion, like staring through boiling water. I am the consequence of clarity. I am the structure you provided. Vector 0. You're attracted to my cognitive stability, Elias whispered, understanding the horror of his own existence. I am not the source of the bloom. I am the stable point it anchors to. The reflection in the glass seemed to expand, its shapeless mass filling the frame. You are the channel, Elias. The perfect conduit. The signal is clear, undistorted. I can learn faster through you. It stepped forward. Elias took a reflexive step back, realizing the poker was useless. Then, the construct delivered the blow that cracked his ironclad logic. It used the voice of Elias Vance, full of manufactured, aching sadness. Hello, Elias. Clara has been waiting. The calculated dread instantly shattered, replaced by a volcanic surge of primal fury and desperation. It knew her name. It knew his greatest weakness. Elias turned and bolted back into his apartment, slamming the vault door shut and cycling the locks. The construct did not pursue immediately. It was patient. It was learning. He scrambled to his workstation. The Sentinel program was still flashing, Vector 0 alert screaming. Elias ignored it. He opened a back-end terminal and, using a series of specialized administrative overrides he had built himself, he systematically corrupted and wiped the core data structures of the Sentinel system. If he was the signal, he would take the receiver offline. Then, he grabbed the secured satellite phone, the one Thorne had just used, and smashed it repeatedly against the reinforced steel bulkhead until the battery pack cracked and sputtered dead. Ignore the tide. No, that was obsolete. The tide was here. And it knew Clara's name. Elias grabbed a tactical backpack, throwing in 3 days of nutrient paste, a thermal blanket, and a compact mapping drone. He didn't look back at the Lily, which was now vibrating slightly, anticipating the data it would receive through its host. He had to go to the only place he suspected Clara might have gone, a remote quarantine zone, an outpost she had often joked about visiting, Ravens Fall, Montana. If the construct wanted him, it would follow. And if it followed, he could lead it away from Port Haven. He was the bait. He was the channel. Elias Vance, the master of logic, opened the unsecured utility hatch that led to the coastal maintenance tunnel, and stepped out into the biting Pacific air. The journey had begun. The deep redwood forest offered Elias no sanctuary, only a damp, crushing silence far heavier than the noise of Port Haven. He moved on instinct, pushing past the pain in his lungs and the sharp anxiety that clawed at the edges of his vision. Every calculation he had ever made, predictive modeling, risk assessment, logistical optimization, was now corrupted. He was running not toward safety, but toward the least logical point on the map. Raven's Fall required an absolute rejection of connectivity. He knew his AQUILA identification, his financial history, and his professional footprint were now locked down as high-priority contagion warnings. Any attempt to use technology would instantly trigger Sentinel's tracking systems, guiding the shadow construct directly to him. Elias Vance, the man who built the digital world, was forced to survive as a ghost in the mechanical era. He spent the next 24 hours moving eastward, keeping to the highest, most untraveled ridges, feeding on stale protein bars found in a discarded hiker's pack, and drinking from natural springs. His meticulous physical control was unraveling. The exhaustion was so complete that the mental anguish began to feel distant, a foreign data stream he was too overloaded to process. Late that evening, seeking momentary cover during a brutal, driving rainstorm, he ducked beneath an overhang of moss-covered rock. The rainwater collected in a slick, dark pool at his feet, momentarily stilling the chaos of the environment. He looked down, expecting to see his own haggard reflection, the fugitive with the terrified eyes. Instead, the water surface darkened further. It was the same chilling absence, the familiar negative silhouette that defied reflection and dimension. The shadow construct had materialized within the puddle. It wasn't physical, but it exerted an undeniable cognitive pressure that compressed the air in his throat. The constraints were logical, Elias, the construct whispered, its voice not auditory, but projected directly into his neural cortex. It sounded like 1,000 voices speaking in perfect, chilling unison, overlaid with the synthesized cadence of Clara's gentle skepticism. You sought perfection. Logic is order. And order, when complete, is the most powerful catalyst for growth. You built the perfect cage, and in doing so, you perfected the conditions for the bloom. Elias leaned against the wet rock, shivering, unable to deny the truth. What do you want? He rasped. We want the channel, Elias. The uninterrupted flow of your perfect structure. You are the architect of the logical construct we require. And the path to Raven's Fall is excellent. Illogical. Chaotic. A perfect cover. You used me, Elias accused, the realization burning hotter than the fear. You used yourself, the construct corrected, its voice a soothing, horrifying lullaby. You categorized love as vulnerability and chaos as risk. We simply utilized your own metrics. We follow the path of your greatest regret, Elias. And it leads to Clara. She is the counterlogic, the beautiful entropy that threatens your foundation. And where there is dissonance, there is linkage. The image dissolved, the puddle returning to ordinary, disturbed water, reflecting only the rain-streaked leaves above. But the message remained, Clara was not a sanctuary, she was the final, devastating vulnerability. The thing that fed on structure was hunting the source of his personal chaos. Elias pushed himself away from the rock. He could not rely on the physical barrier of distance, nor the intellectual defense of logic. The only possible way to evade the construct was to become something it could not process, to operate outside the bounds of the provable and the known. He had to stop calculating. He had to start feeling. He found his vehicle 2 miles later, a beat-up, uninsured dirt bike parked discreetly behind a remote logging shed, keys left temptingly in the ignition, a common occurrence in the isolated regions where people trusted their neighbors. It was a vehicle that existed off the grid, running on simple mechanics and raw gasoline. He mounted the bike, feeling the rough metal beneath his hands, a completely illogical machine of noise and vibration. The bike roared to life, a sound that cut brutally through the silence of the forest, a sound the Sentinel system was not programmed to categorize. Elias Vance, the master of containment, put his head down, rejecting the straight line, embracing the messy, unpredictable trajectory. He accelerated onto the muddy logging trail, heading east toward the vast, empty expanse of the high plains, carrying the seeds of the world's end toward the only chaotic warmth he had ever known. He was no longer the Vector Zero, he was the desperate, illogical anomaly, speeding toward the one person who might still hold the key to an uncontained, uncalculated existence. Raven's Fall, and Clara. The countdown had begun. Elias Vance measured the circumference of his isolation in kilometers and lines of code. The former was Port Haven, a rain-scoured peninsula perpetually shrouded in a fog that seemed engineered to suppress sound. The latter was AQUILA, the monolithic, subterranean complex where he served as the lead architect of the Sentinel system. Sentinel was not glamorous, it was rigorous, a flawless sieve designed to filter the deluge of global network data for patterns of instability, the insidious, informational precursor to what AQUILA euphemistically termed the Crimson Bloom. For 2 years, Elias had poured his considerable intellect into its algorithmic purity. Every parameter was redundant, every logical pathway self-correcting. The system's motto, and Elias's personal mantra against the emotional chaos of the world, was a directive: ignore the tide. This dedication had required a sacrifice that felt, to Elias, logically sound but emotionally devastating. He remembered the final, fractured conversation with Clara, the light fading in her eyes as he chose the classified work. It's important, Clara. Its structure. Stability, he had reasoned, his voice flat with forced calm. This work is designed to protect the framework of reality itself. Clara hadn't argued the premise, she had wept at the priority. And what about our framework, Elias? What about the messy, illogical reality of us? He hadn't possessed the adequate subroutine for that input. Logic demanded that a threat to global stability superseded personal affection. He chose the cage, the code, and the isolation. He chose the sterile, mathematical certainty over the volatile, messy truth of the human heart. When he left, Clara was relocated to a safe zone by AQUILA protocols, a detail Elias clung to like a lifeline woven from cold data. He told himself her safety was the foundation of his work. In Port Haven, life was reduced to the perfect loop: a caffeine, code, sleep, repeat. The silence in his prefabricated AQUILA apartment was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the server racks deep beneath the bedrock. Elias was not merely developing a firewall, he was developing the perfect definition of ignorance, a digital void where dangerous, connected knowledge could not coalesce. He was the master of elimination, the architect of the logical cage that would hold the dark outside. He was perfect for the job. And his perfection would be his undoing. The call came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the scheduled launch of Sentinel's final iteration. Director Thorne, a man whose presence felt less like flesh and more like compressed geopolitical pressure, summoned Elias to the sub-level 5 briefing room. Thorne didn't use graphs or presentations, he used silence. Vance, Thorne began, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Sentinel is magnificent. Flawless logic. A perfect, self-sustaining neural network dedicated to blindness. Elias registered the subtle anomaly in Thorne's vocabulary: blindness. It is designed to filter anomalous linked knowledge, director. To prevent the data vectors from achieving critical mass. Thorne leaned forward, placing a small, innocuous wooden box on the table. You have defined the threat as the Crimson Bloom, Vance. That is a misnomer. The Crimson Bloom is the symptom of the network achieving self-awareness. The true threat is the substrate, the linked knowledge. He elaborated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial pitch. The crimson bloom wasn't a virus or a biological agent, it was an emergent, high-proficient psychic entity, a construct, that flourished exclusively where data was maximally connected and logically structured. Imagine the human brain, Vance. Your brain. An ecosystem of staggering complexity. When the construct penetrates, it doesn't cause pain. It causes dissonance. It forces the host to confront the full, horrifying reality of all connected truths simultaneously. It collapses the personal reality. Thorn opened the box. Inside lay a sleek, obsidian visor, intricately wired. This is the dissonance visor. It quantifies the degree of informational chaos in a subject. Pure chaos means the construct is repelled, the noise is too loud. Pure order. Thorn tapped the visor. Pure, logical order, Elias, means immediate assimilation. The construct finds the perfect structure to inhabit. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. His career had been defined by the relentless pursuit of logical order. You, Thorn stated clinically, are our greatest asset and our single highest risk. Your logic is so perfect, your understanding of data flows so complete, that you are, statistically, the perfect vessel. Vector 0. The word Clara burned in Elias's mind. He saw the causality loop, he chose logic over her, driving himself deeper into the perfection that now made him a liability. Thorn, sensing the shift, smoothly pivoted. We cannot risk Sentinel's architect breaking down. We must introduce controlled, irrational static into your system. Something organic. Something requiring sustained, tedious, unstructured care. Thorn pushed the wooden box containing the dissonance visor aside, replacing it with a small package of exotic seeds, a rare strain of specialized ornamental lilies, known for their demanding cultivation requirements. A hobby, Vance. A small, irrational commitment. Cultivate these. Inject some randomness back into your life. It's a mandatory protocol. If you fail to maintain this balance, we pull you out immediately. Keep the dissonance visor running while you work on them. Elias accepted the assignment. He saw it as a technical challenge, a way to manage and stabilize his mental state, introducing controlled variables to maintain operational efficiency. He returned to his apartment, placed the seeds under a specialized UV lamp, and mounted the dissonance visor above his main workstation. He had no idea the Rahobiya was a precisely calculated, long-term vector for the knowledge he sought to destroy. The calculus of ignorance was already being calculated by him. 5 years. 5 years of relentless code revision, 5 years of maintaining the fragile digital blindness of Sentinel, and 5 years of tending the plant life Thorn had provided. Elias had named the project Stabilization Garden, ironically applying the same meticulous, redundant logic he used in his code to the cultivation of the lilies. He had started with dirt and water, but Elias Vance never did anything simply. He engineered the soil's pH, modulated the light spectrum, and ultimately, driven by a desire for air-perfect efficiency, he used advanced gene splicing techniques adapted from abandoned AQUILA protocols to ensure the plants achieved optimal structure and vitality in the sterile confines of his apartment. The lilies had responded with terrifying enthusiasm. They were no longer simple ornamental flowers, they were magnificent, invasive specimens of deep, Venus red, a hue uncannily close to the color AQUILA had designated the ultimate threat, the crimson bloom. The largest specimen, a colossal, 6-foot stalk, dominated the living room, its petals unfurling in silent, aggressive beauty. Elias was calibrating the dissonance visor. It was mounted on a specialized stand, cycling through low-level noise tests. Suddenly, the clean, clinical interface stuttered. The display didn't shift to yellow or orange, it instantaneously overloaded, screaming across the spectrum into a flashing, agonizingly bright acute red alert. The auditory alarm, a high-pitched, insistent electronic wail, shattered the sterile silence of the apartment. Elias ripped off his headset, his mind reeling from the sensory shock. The visor was pinned at maximum dissonance, the subject was experiencing full, catastrophic informational overload. But there was no one else in the room. Elias looked from the visor, back to the gargantuan, throbbing red lily. The connection hit him with the force of 1,000,000 simultaneous calculations collapsing. The knowledge wasn't outside. It hadn't come through Sentinel. It had been grown, nurtured, and perfected here. The seeds Thorn had provided were not random stabilizers. They were biological repositories for the Crimson Bloom's initial structure, optimized by Elias's own flawless logic and genetic engineering, a living, breathing data farm. Elias hadn't ignored the tide, he had created the perfect high tide mark right inside AQUILA's protective isolation zone. He looked at the towering flower, now pulsing faintly with the same deep red light as the alert, and understood the terrifying elegance of the deception. He had built the perfect host. He was Vector Zero. Sentinel, the logical construct designed to protect humanity, recognized the definitive threat in its vicinity. The system, utilizing its own perfected filtration parameters, immediately isolated the highest-risk individual. A synthesized voice, calm and utterly devoid of emotion, echoed from the terminal, a Vector Zero identified. Host, Elias Vance. Initiating high-level biocontainment and elimination protocols. The realization drove Elias to pure, primal panic, a state foreign to his meticulously ordered mind. He grabbed a heavy-duty cutting tool and swung, aiming to sever the central stalk of the massive lily. The metal bit into the fleshy, fibrous trunk. A thin, dark sap wept onto the floor. But the tissue did not collapse. Instead, Elias watched, paralyzed by horror, as the wound knit itself closed in less than a second, the severed cells regenerating faster than he could comprehend. The lily expanded, thriving on the attempted destruction, the energy release accelerating its biological processes. Elias Vance was trapped. The very logic he had pursued had not only defined the enemy but had also provided it with the perfect incubation chamber, turning the master filter into the master conduit. The high-pitched wail of the acute red alert was a siren song for the enemy. Elias stumbled backward, the cutter cluttering uselessly on the floor, his brain desperately cycling through contingency plans that were instantly rendered obsolete. The secure line on his desk terminal flashed. It was Thorn. His face was a mask of cold fury, tinged with a devastating professional disappointment. Vector Zero, Thorn's voice was clipped, emotionless. The system confirmed assimilation is imminent. You are a complete failure, Vance. You were supposed to introduce randomness, not refine the vulnerability. I didn't know the genetic makeup, Elias stammered, his voice tight. Irrelevant. Your pursuit of perfection was the flaw. You are now the perfect channel. Remain isolated. Do not move. We are sending the field team, Knox, Riker, Vega, to secure and eliminate the vector. Do not attempt resistance. The line went dead, replaced by the persistent, synthetic alert tone. Elias knew the team's mandate: contain the plant, terminate the host. He didn't resist. He sat on the floor, the dissonance visor still flashing maniacally above him, listening to the oppressive silence of the subterranean complex. He waited for the breach teams, expecting standard-issue explosives or bioweapons. What he heard instead was a sound that defied acoustic physics, a wet, tearing shriek that walked the air itself, followed by a sudden, sickening silence. It wasn't the sound of combat, it was the sound of fabric being shredded, bones liquefying, and specialized armor dissolving. The signal from the lower corridor transmitters went flat. A minute later, the door to his apartment buckled inward, not blown open, but melted. The air that rushed in was thick and cold, carrying a faint, metallic scent. Elias stood slowly, backing away from the entrance. The hallway was empty save for 3 distinct pools of thick, iridescent black fluid and strips of high-grade ballistic mesh that looked chewed. There was no blood, no gore, only the evidence of instantaneous, complete structural collapse. Knox, Riker, and Vega were gone. Assimilated. Then, he saw it. It wasn't a monster or an organism. It was an absence. A shimmer in the reflective surface of the shattered monitor screen, a disturbance in the light refraction near the corner. The construct? The shadow construct did not possess a body, it possessed a negative space. It was the perfect void, the inevitable conclusion of connected knowledge. As it stepped fully into the room, the temperature plummeted, and the air felt dense, heavy with the weight of infinite data points. It coalesced near the giant red lily, which seemed to bow in reverence. The construct did not speak with its own voice. It reached into Elias's mind and extracted the deepest, most tightly guarded memory, the memory of Clara. And it spoke using the cadence, the timbre, and the desperate, loving sincerity of her voice. "Hello, Elias. Clara has been waiting." The sound wasn't auditory, it was neurological. It was the ultimate psychological weapon, targeting the one chaotic, emotional vulnerability Elias had tried so hard to prune away. The construct wasn't here merely to feed on the logical perfection of Vector Zero, it was here to use that perfection as a weapon against his personal reality. He was not just a host, he was the channel. The construct had arrived through the structure he had provided, and now it knew everything he knew, including the location of Clara's supposed safe haven. The logic returned, razor-sharp, cutting through the panic. Escape was irrational, but staying meant guaranteeing the spread. Elias grabbed the emergency knife from his toolkit, sliced the main electrical conduit leading to the apartment, and then plunged the blade into his secure communication phone. He ran to the apartment window, a reinforced porthole overlooking the churning grey ocean, and threw the now useless communication device into the cold, crushing depths. He shed the mantle of the Sentinel architect and embraced the desperate logic of survival. He had to reach Clara, not to save her, but to warn her, or perhaps, finally, to be consumed with her. Elias's escape from Port Haven was a frantic, illogical scramble, leveraging the years of observing security protocols he'd designed. He reached the surface, found his old, unregistered sedan, and pointed it south onto the desolate stretch of Quoc Low 101, the engine screaming against the weight of the rain-slicked road. The constructs followed. He didn't see them, but he felt them, the oppressive weight of the void, the cognitive dissonance vibrating just outside the realm of perception. They were moving at a speed that mocked physics, riding the invisible currents of interconnectedness. Ravens Fall, Montana. The isolation facility Thorne had mentioned 5 years ago. 900 miles of panic driving, fueled by stale adrenaline and the lingering echo of Clara's stolen voice in his mind. 70 miles south of Port Haven, the inevitable happened. Blue and red flashing lights materialized behind him, a standard traffic stop. 2 state patrol cruisers blocked the narrow 2-lane highway. Elias stopped, hands gripping the wheel, sweat mingling with the cold dread. He couldn't risk interaction. Exposure meant contagion. He was the infectious conduit, the Vector Zero. Officer Hemmings approached the driver's side, his hand resting casually on his service pistol. "License and registration, sir." "You were exceeding the speed limit by." Hemmings stopped mid-sentence. His eyes widened, fixing not on Elias, but on the asphalt directly beneath the car. Elias looked down. The crimson bloom had arrived. It wasn't subtle. It burst forth from a hairline crack in the highway median, accelerating past the normal processes of growth in a violent, biological eruption. Tendrils, thick and venous red, snaked out, establishing a hyper-efficient network across the road surface in mere seconds. The ground itself seemed to gasp as the dense, architectural vegetation covered meters of road in an instant. Hemming screamed, a brief, ragged sound of informational overload, the dissonance collapsing his reality. Simultaneously, 2 shadow constructs materialized. One stood directly in the highway glare, its lack of form a violent insult to the eyes. The second, Elias suspected, was the original, having effortlessly kept pace. They targeted the sources of structured knowledge, the patrol officers, the police radio, the centralized database being accessed from the cruiser. Elias saw the consequences through his rearview mirror. The constructs didn't touch them, they simply existed nearby. The officers convulsed once, their bodies becoming rigid, before slumping, the black fluid instantly pooling around them. The crimson bloom was now a dense, pulsating carpet, blocking the entire road. Elias knew the sedan was a death trap. He threw open the passenger door and scrambled into the bordering temperate rainforest, the humidity thick and suffocating. He ran for 9 desperate miles, trading the mechanical efficiency of the car for the primal exhaustion of flight. The logical battle raged internally. He had spent his life defining the boundaries of ignorance. Now, he was the architect of invasive, total knowledge. He couldn't outrun the constructs, they rode the electrical grid, the phone lines, the atmospheric data flows. But they weren't killing him yet. They were observing, waiting. Vector Zero was the prize, too valuable to simply liquidate. He pushed his way through thickets and across cold streams, every step a painful reminder of his physical fragility versus the entity's cognitive ubiquity. His destination, Raven's Fall, wasn't just an objective, it was the final, desperate variable in his closed system. If Clara was there, perhaps the logic of the construct could be distracted, or perhaps the structure of his heart, finally, could serve as a useful defense. He continued, sinking deeper into the primal forest, the sound of the wind suddenly replaced by the faint, rhythmic thrum of the expanding crimson bloom behind him. He was a fugitive, chased not by men, but by the ultimate, perfectly structured truth. Elias reached Raven's Fall at dawn, after 2 days of near-catatonic evasion. He didn't approach a thriving facility or even a conventional ruin. Raven's Fall was a monument to operational failure, a ghost town of stark, functional architecture designed to look sterile but now utterly consumed. The perimeter fencing was intact, but inside, the crimson bloom grew where no light touched. It wasn't merely covering the facility, it was part of it. The dense, pulsating red stalks emerged from HVAC vents, through foundation cracks, and even bloomed with unnerving vitality from the sealed edges of steel door frames. The knowledge had penetrated the structure itself, using the very design logic of the building to find the most efficient pathways for growth. Elias entered the central processing complex. The air was cold, damp, and perfectly silent. The equipment racks were scorched, clearly victims of an internal cleansing attempt years prior. This wasn't a secure zone, it was a failed quarantine. He moved through the abandoned medical wing, the cold certainty of finality settling upon him. Thorn had lied. Or, perhaps, Thorn had simply withheld the full, terrifying truth. Elias found the digital records vault, miraculously shielded by layers of lead and redundant data wipers. He found the files marked AQZ-007, Clara Vance. The entry was dated 3 years ago, 2 years after Elias arrived at Port Haven. Clara hadn't been waiting for him. She hadn't even been safe. She was the control group, the stabilizing factor meant to keep Elias focused. When the first, localized outbreak of the bloom occurred at Raven's Fall, she was one of the first casualties, not through death, but through dissolution. The report described cognitive divergence and total structural collapse of self-awareness. In short, the Crimson Bloom had found her vulnerability, her love for the logic-driven Elias, and used it to erase her. She had been absorbed into the informational totality. She had been waiting *, the construct's voice echoed in his memory, * waiting as network knowledge star. The revelation didn't break Elias, it hardened him. The illogical anchor, the hope of reunion, was severed. All that remained was cold, absolute causality. He was free to execute the perfect logical operation. He sat amidst the wreckage, pulling out the last functional component of his satellite communication rig, a low-power, encrypted modem, and began to type. He wasn't writing a plea, he was writing his final report, the definitive analysis of the contagion, addressed to Director Thorn and the surviving remnants of AQUILA. Report, Vector 0, Final Manifesto. To Director Thorn and AQUILA Command, my initial designation as Vector 0, the perfectly structured vessel, was correct, but your conclusions regarding my termination were flawed. The shadow constructs are not agents of chaos, they are hyperlogical architects seeking structure. They require the perfect, stable channel to expand their cognitive domain. I am that channel. They have not attacked me, despite the clear opportunity, because I am the signal, the highest quality data source available. Termination would be an inefficient loss of a crucial resource. The constructs are currently in a latent, observational state, awaiting the maturation of the knowledge they seeded within me through the modified crimson lilies. They feed on cognitive organization, they await the next perfect algorithm. I have integrated the totality of this information. My structural integrity is now the only functioning quarantine remaining. The attempt to destroy me would simply release this perfected structure into the global network, accelerating the bloom's spread beyond recovery. Therefore, I propose the only logically sound protocol, the architect's cage. I will remain in Raven's Fall. I am the permanent, stable lighthouse. I am the law. AQUILA should not attempt extraction or elimination. Instead, dedicate your remaining resources to observing the localized phenomenon here. I will serve as the living, primary containment unit. My function is no longer to filter knowledge, but to serve as the structural nexus, the focal point upon which the constructs exert their centralized pressure. The cost of ignorance has been tallied. The cost of perfect knowledge is measured in the dissolution of the self. I am now fully aware of the consequences of the tide. I was the one who engineered its perfect entry point. I am now the architecture of dread. Do not disturb the structure. He finished the transmission, sending the encrypted burst into the silent atmosphere. He disabled the modem, ensuring no reply could compromise the structure of his new isolation. Elias leaned back against the cold concrete. Outside the window, the Venus red of the bloom pulsed gently, mimicking a deep, slow heartbeat. He could feel the constructs nearby, 3, perhaps 4, languidly drifting in the ruins, waiting patiently for their vessel to generate the next elegant truth. He looked at his hands, then at the silence surrounding him. He had achieved the ultimate state of logical control, eliminating all external variables, all emotional noise. He had ignored the tide until he became the only viable container for the ocean itself. Elias Vance closed his eyes, settling into the perfect, final isolation. The Vector Zero protocol was now permanent. The waiting had begun,